I'm starting a new series on this channel called NBR Nerf Blaster Restoration. It sounds kind of like mending, but rather than making the blaster work and fire again, I'm going a step further into something more difficult where I make it not only work like new, but look new as well. I've done a couple restoration videos in the past, but they have no commentary in them, maybe some subtitles, but I think it would be easier for all of you if I just verbally explain my process. The first episode is going to be involving a blaster that's not necessarily been loved to death and beaten up, but left outside and abandoned in the weather for a decade. This is what this Night Finder used to look like. Yeah, there's quite a lot wrong with this one. When these come out of the factory brand new, they have some lubricant in there, maybe some white lithium grease, that will keep parts from wearing out and it will help them move a little bit quicker, and it prolongs the life significantly. But if they're left outside and they get dirt on the lubricant, and the lubricant eventually just turns into powder, which does the opposite of what it's supposed to do, and it makes parts stick and they just kind of grind against each other. Actually, here's a good analogy. You have cartilage in between your bones that keeps them from grinding against each other. If you don't have that cartilage, your bones are just going to grind and wear down, and that's not good. Same thing here. Before I do any of this, please watch the entire video, know exactly what you're doing. I'm using some chemicals that are not necessarily super dangerous, but if used incorrectly, they can kill you. If you don't necessarily care about how your blaster looks and you want it to work like new, the easiest thing you can do is take it apart and re-lubricate it, because these parts will stick. When heat destroys the lubricant and turns it into powder, it will also slightly warp the plastic, causing parts to be tight, or depending on how they're facing the sun, they get looser, but I think this is just worn out. You can see the outdoors have done a number to the inside of this thing. Plenty of dirt and actually rusted springs. Let's take a look. Yep, it is not only dry, but the O-ring is covered in dirt, and you can even hear it. Obviously, with something dirty like this, you should just wash the parts in some warm soap and water. If I'm washing out this entire shell, I need to remove everything, including the electronics. I also want to show you how to clean the leads in here, and in order to do that, I have to remove these contacts by prying them out. Don't grab these with pliers and try to pull them out. You might cut yourself. I've done it before. It's terrible. So just be careful. Now that I've washed some of the plastic parts, I'd like to clean some of the metal ones like the screws and springs. If you ever want to do maintenance on your blaster again, you probably want to clean the screws so they won't strip out. So you would toss them in some vinegar. I have some in a little container here. Mine is red because I've had it for so long, it's sort of evaporated and diluted, so it's a little more acidic. If you have regular vinegar, you probably want to wait about 24 hours, no more than that, because your screws and springs might start to break down. What vinegar is also really good for is corrosion. If you've removed your contacts, you can dip this in the vinegar. Try not to dip the wires, you don't want it to short. For anything that's hard to reach, you can take a pipette if you happen to have some handy, and just drop it on there. For relubricating moving parts, you're going to want to use silicone grease or white lithium grease in a squeeze tube like this. This is fine. What you might have lying around is WD-40. Before you run and get that, I'm going to tell you to stop right there. No. Bad. Don't use anything in a can. It will melt your O-rings, weaken your plastic, and it smells terrible. Trust me, I've used this as my first lubricant ever for a year. It's bad. It might work at first, but over time, it will destroy your blaster. Same thing goes for anything in a can like dry lube, canola oil. You might as well just clean the O-ring off and not lubricate it at all. Here's something that can affect the function of your blaster over time is if the O-ring is super worn out, that wrecks your seal. Even if you relubricate it, it's not going to make a difference. What you should feel is some friction in here. I feel none at all. What I recommend for fixing the seal is Teflon tape if you have it, or if you have access to it. If not, you can just use a little bit of electrical tape under the O-ring, or duct tape, or toilet paper, just something under the O-ring that doesn't stick out too much and interfere with the seal. So now, there's some friction in there. That should work fine. Just kind of rub it around. You really don't need much to get things moving. This is my favorite part, sun-faded parts. And this goes for all of the ones that have a yellow tint to them, or if they're darker on the outside than they are on the inside. And this happens when the bromine in the plastic is rapidly attracted to the surface when it's left in heat or ultraviolet light, which is usually the sun. A method I use to reverse this process is called retrobrite. It's what a lot of people were using on old computers to turn them back to white when they would turn ivory over time. Basically, you use hair bleach. You might not have this lying around, so you gotta go find it. And there's a lot of different ones to get. You want to get the highest percent of hydrogen peroxide. I have 40%, and I use the cream instead of the liquid because I can just apply it with a Q-tip. So this is one of the dangerous chemicals I was talking about. It's not necessarily dangerous, but it does have fumes, and it will burn your skin. So gloves are necessary. Just kind of paint it on, not on the entire thing. If you do it, don't do it too thick, otherwise you might have a swirl texture on the plastic or the paint that's going to wreck it. After applying your retrobrite, you want to put your parts in a plastic bag and seal it off. After you've done that, you want to put these outside in the sun. I know, it's kind of crazy that you can just apply a chemical and put these in the same environment to reverse the process. Here they are in the middle of my yard, so that when the sun sets, the shade won't go over them because they're going to be out here all day. If you come out and check on them, you'll notice they get ridiculously hot. It's almost concerning how hot that this will get. But don't worry, it's not going to melt or anything unless maybe it's softer plastic, but it should be fine. This is the best way to do this. It's ridiculously bright outside, which is perfect. If it's cloudy or raining, you're better off doing it inside, and I have some tricks for that. The alternatives I find works pretty well is taking a box, lining it with tin foil, and installing a black light in the top. The black light has UV in it, which seems to work pretty well, and the tin foil sort of reflects that black light, so it gets all the sides of what you're trying to retrobrite. It's basically a homemade tanning machine. If you have access to a real one, that's awesome. Use it. Another thing that seems to work, not very well, but it does work, is my shop light. I'm not sure if it has UV in it, or if the person that invented retrobrite did some overcomplicated science and regular light will work. While I'm waiting for the retrobrite to do its thing, I'm gonna work on this. This kind of plastic that's softer cannot be retrobrited. When it fades, it loses the color. The color is sucked out of it, so you have to repaint these kinds of things. The closest color I could find to Nerf orange is this Rust-Oleum fluorescent orange. It's sign paint, but I've used it a lot on this kind of faded plastic, and it seems to work fine. Because this is not the right paint, and it's not going to stay on very well without clear coat, I'm just going to use some glossy clear coat to give it a nice finish. But before I do any of this painting stuff, I'm going to have to sand this so it has a nice surface for the paint to grip. After 3 days of retrobrite, I'm calling this done. Even though it's not fully gray, the yellowing was really, really bad, and I'm sure there's a better version of retrobrite that you can use to get this even better looking. But if the yellowing is bad enough to begin with, after a while it's going to come back. Not all the way, just some. And if that really bothers you, you might as well paint the plastic, like what I've been doing with this whiteout long strike here. This has been retrobrited twice for a week each. I'm going to reassemble this light piece first because there's some parts in here that are easy to lose because they're really small. But this is a perfect example of what friction does over time. This lens is supposed to be movable and stay in place. It's turned into a maraca. And that's from wearing down these little teeth on these pieces here. What I like to do for these, which I've done in the past, and it works perfectly, is using a little bit of super glue, not a ton, and just putting it on these ribs here. I'm just gonna let this dry. And it doesn't even have to be specifically this piece for the Night Finder. You're gonna have a lot of worn out parts, a lot of worn out catch notches as well, like this kind of wearing down and slipping out from under the catch. This thing's a terrible example, but I think you know what I mean. For painting small details, I normally have paint palettes, but I just like to use a plate, lean it up against something, and have the paint go into this little spot here, and then when that dries and I want to do a different color, I can turn it around. I figured that out myself. I don't know if that's an original idea or if someone's probably figured it out already. And for getting the paint into there, I use some pipettes so I don't have to pour the paint out of my containers and get it all over the lip and get the lid stuck on my paint. For paint, I use Tester's model paint. This stuff is awesome. I use it all the time. I'm going to be mixing white and fluorescent orange to get that sort of factory orange I want this logo to be. I need to thin the paint out a little bit. There is Tester's thinner, but I don't have any left, so I'm just going to use some of this lacquer thinner. It doesn't work as well, but it will work. And after that, I want the logo to stay on and not come off, so I'm going to use some Tester's top coat, clear coat. When you're applying the paint, for bigger details, you can get away with using a small brush. You just want to make sure you have a little bit more thinner than paint in your paint. That'll keep you from getting brush marks in your paint and making it look all weird. For really small details like this, I like to use toothpicks. I use these a lot, even for big details sometimes. The way the toothpick works, and you'll know you have enough thinner if this does work, is I'll get a little drop of paint on there, and when I touch it to the surface, it kind of spreads out. And I can sort of guide it around. It's all done, I put it back together. But I feel like I should mention this one little thing that I like to do. It's kind of unnecessary, is repainting the screws, because the vinegar will strip all the black paint off of them. I just take cardboard, drill some holes in it, shove the screws in there, and paint only the heads with some black primer spray paint. And the reason you only paint the heads is because if you get the threads, it's going to give you a harder time getting the screws in there. You might even crack your screw holes. Now the reveal. Ta-da! There it is, next to the mint condition one. See, they're pretty similar now compared to how different this one used to look, but there's still some color differences. Like, the orange on here is much brighter than this one, but I don't think this one was this dull out of the box. The retrobrite also wasn't powerful enough to completely fix this one, so it's still a little bit yellow, but very, very close to the light gray here. The orange parts also came out fantastic, especially the priming ring. This side of it used to be nearly white. Now it's this beautiful bright orange that's a little bit brighter than this one. I think this one is also a little bit faded. The seal is also very good compared to what it was before. The O-ring was completely dry and covered in dirt. Now it works fantastic. The trigger doesn't stick anymore. And now the lens will move freely, but it does not shake around at all when I shake it. Now that I'm done, I must ask, how was that? It felt a little complicated and out of order for me. My main objective on this channel, other than comedy, is inspiration. So if you were able to take anything away from this that you didn't know before that will be useful to you, then I've done this correctly.